Let's talk about how spirituality can really help us or help people, and how it can also create hurting or pain or unhelpfulness in our lives. Now, I'm sharing this coming from about 17 years of being on a spiritual path. I am a celibate monk in the Brahmacharya tradition of India, and I have experimented with many different types of spirituality and I would say transformational paths before settling on this one that I've been on and highly engaged in for the last 17 years, right? So, in everything I'm about to share with you, and this is true for everything that I post actually, I've practiced and I've been through. So, I don't like preaching from above or condescending or things that I don't know about. I think that's true most of the time, actually. But I want to share with you this topic today because I think it can really help you if you know someone who's on a spiritual path or someone who's on a transformational path. And if you are, and how we can steer clear of certain obstacles on the path and really leverage it so that it can help us create whatever it is that we are looking for in our lives. All right? So here's the first thing. When a spiritual path or a transformational path is done with sincerity, vulnerability, and ownership, what we become is really quite limitless. Now, I have been fortunate to be surrounded by remarkable people on this spiritual and transformational path that I've been on for the last almost 2 decades. And when I've seen people who have been sincere, vulnerable, and taken ownership for themselves within a path, they transform and their lives transform remarkably. I mean, they make more money, which may or may not be important to you. They have really fulfilling careers or whatever it is, the role that they're playing in their life. It's just touching and fulfilling, and they're powerful in it. And then their experience of themselves is remarkable. Like they just have this beautiful relationship with themselves where they feel so connected and touched. And in fact, every time like we ever talk or they share in a public program, they just talk about how grateful they are. Like, that's all they say. They're just like, I'm so grateful. They're always talking about how grateful they are, right? They don't talk about how they're struggling. They don't talk about obstacles that they have. They don't talk about anything except how grateful they are. It's really fantastic. And I use this as a model for myself when I'm like struggling with something or I feel stuck or I'm experiencing some kind of internal, external obstacle. Is how do I feel grateful for something, right? So this is really how spirituality or a transformational path can help us, is just by being sincere, being vulnerable, and taking ownership. And what I mean by that is like sincerity means you're not kind of half-hearted. You're not like half in, half out. Now, it's fine if you're just exploring or experimenting, but if you're on a dedicated path and you're kind of like half in, half out, you're not going to reap the benefits of it. And I've seen this in many different people in many different paths, complaining or talking about how something hasn't really worked for them, which is fine. But you can see or you understand or they even share how they didn't really dedicate themselves to it, right? There's this great analogy or aphorism around how you can't find a well if you don't dig deep, right? So you just need to dig deep as far as you can until you hit water, then see the quality of the water that you're finding in this metaphor and see if it suits you, right? And if it doesn't suit you, fine. Go dig another hole someplace, but dig deep enough in that well as well and see what kind of the quality of the water is for you there, right? So that's sincerity. Vulnerability. I mean, you're not going to make progress, I don't think, in anything if you're not vulnerable with whatever it is that you're engaged in, right? Meaning you're not giving yourself to it. Your heart's not in it, literally and figuratively, the energetic heart being in it per se, right? So if you're not really giving yourself to it and lowering your guard and not being defensive, which is a way that I have been defensive for much of my life until more recently, then you're not going to reap the benefits of this path that you're dedicating yourself to, right? And then finally, ownership. I mean, again, this is a huge piece because a lot of people will expect whoever the leader is of the path or the path itself to solve their problems. And in some cases, that's true because there are certain practices or you could say protocols that you follow. And this is the case in my life where I'm a vegetarian, I don't do drugs or alcohol. I live a pretty pure lifestyle. And that's something that when I take ownership for living that way, it promotes an incredible sense of freedom inside of me. It's that teaching of how discipline creates freedom. Right? So if I take ownership of this path and I'm really owning all of these practices and everything that I'm taking on as like how this is going to help me in my life, I'm not expecting something out there or someone out there to solve my problems, right? Which is, again, a huge pitfall that I've seen people get into on a spiritual transformational path, especially when there's like one leader in charge, right? It's whenever people start to veer off and they start to get these results they don't really like, they don't take ownership for maybe how they are affecting the results that they're getting, right? As opposed to blaming or holding someone else or something else accountable for them, right? So that's how spirituality can really help, right? Let's talk about how it can hurt. Now, again, I'm sharing this with you because I have dabbled in this world of how spirituality can be unhelpful for transformation or whatever our intent actually is. It can be unhelpful in relationships, honestly. So when spirituality is done to avoid how we're feeling and avoid limited aspects of ourselves, it can be quite brutal. Right? So for example, when I first started studying spirituality and meditation, I loved meditation. It was actually the one thing in my life that I was really good at. That's with an asterisk, actually. Really good at naturally. Everything else in my life that I've gotten competent at or decent at, I've had to work really hard to do. And that includes like being a psychologist, psychotherapist, being a monk, being a yoga person, yoga practitioner, being an advanced rock climber, like all these things that I've done that I've been like successful with, I've really had to work at, except for meditation. Now, here's partly why I was so good at meditation. I hated how I felt, and meditation gave me an escape from it. And here's what's interesting. Now, I'll go back to saying I wasn't that good at it, but it was easy for me because I was able to not have to feel how I was feeling. Now, isn't that interesting? That's not the point of meditation. The meditation is to have it transform us through a certain way of being, through a certain kind of surrendering into, as opposed to avoidance of an aspect of ourselves. Right? So a lot of people actually, in many different meditation movements, have had and promoted, I would say, escaping an experience as opposed to embracing and accepting ourselves and then transforming, right? Wholeheartedly or in a full, natural, embodied, holistic way, right? So if we're using spirituality to avoid feeling bad, it's not going to be helpful in the end, because it will lead to a downfall in some way or capacity. I've seen this dozens of times with people, right? They expect meditation or a spiritual path to have them feel better. It doesn't. So they're like, this path isn't right for me. What was really happening was they were using spirituality or meditation to avoid how they felt inside of themselves, right? And there's a way that you can do both, where you can really embrace yourself and welcome all these aspects of ourselves that are unpleasant, and then bring that with us into the spiritual path, right? So that's the one of the main pieces. The other piece is that if we become righteous about it, and we're kind of like, yeah, and I did this too in the beginning, like after I unlocked this feeling amazing for myself, the first thing I did was went and espoused about how great it was and I had this, I didn't say this, but I definitely had this feeling or this idea that if everyone did what I was doing, then they would feel better. And it's not true. Like, everybody has their own path. Now, there's a way to avoid this, which is through the first part, vulnerability. Through sharing about my own experience with this path, then people get something out of it. They're moved by what you're sharing. And if they care about you, it inspires them to do something similar, most likely, right? So if we get righteous about the path that we're on, whether it's transformation or spirituality, then it's going to actually repel people away from you wherever the righteousness arises from. So for example, righteousness is a form of defense, right? Righteousness means I am right and you are wrong. Now, confidence or inspiration is like I am right and we could all be right. Let me share about how, not that I'm right, because right, wrong, it creates that duality, but how if there's something inside of me that I love, I could share that as opposed to being righteous. Yes? So righteousness defends from an insecurity, always. Righteousness always defends from an insecurity. And if we're using a path to become more righteous per se, then it's because we're not focusing and we're not welcoming an aspect of ourselves that we're insecure about. Right? So I hope you found this was helpful. All my best, and I'll see you next time.